She was mopping the airport at 2 a.m. The billionaire saw the childhood photo of his lost daughter and froze. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Grace Miller pushed her cleaning cart down Terminal 4's endless corridor. 3:30 in the morning at LAX meant empty gates, scattered newspapers, and the kind of silence that made her footsteps echo like whispers from another world. She'd been walking these same halls for 8 years now, ever since she turned 15 and convinced the airport management that she was old enough to work the graveyard shift. "Just you and me again," she murmured to her reflection in the polished floor, watching the mop create perfect arcs across the marble. The airport at this hour felt like a cathedral, vast, empty, and full of stories that travelers had left behind. Grace paused at gate 47, the same spot where she always took her break, from her pocket. She pulled out a small, weathered photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. The little girl in the picture couldn't have been more than 4, with wild curls and bright green eyes that seemed to sparkle even through the faded colors. A tiny scar cut through the child's left eyebrow, probably from some long-forgotten tumble. "Who were you, little one?" Grace whispered, tracing the child's face with her finger. "And who was I supposed to be?" This photograph was her only connection to a past that felt more like a dream than memory. Sister Margaret at St. Anne's Orphanage had told her it was found in her pocket when she arrived 19 years ago. A scared, silent 4-year-old who wouldn't speak for months, the nun said she'd been found wandering the streets of downtown LA. No family, no explanation, just this picture clutched in her tiny fist. Grace had spent countless nights staring at this image, wondering if the little girl was her, wondering who had taken the photo, wondering if somewhere out there, someone was still looking for her. The child's smile was so genuine, so loved. It was clear that whoever had taken this picture cared deeply for her. "Another family reunion that'll never happen," she said with a bitter laugh, tucking the photo back into her uniform pocket. The automatic doors whooshed open as a few early morning travelers began trickling in. Grace gathered her supplies and moved toward Terminal 3, where the red-eye flights from New York would be arriving soon. She'd learned to read the airport's rhythm, when to disappear into the shadows and when to emerge with her cleaning cart. As she rounded the corner near Gate 32, Grace spotted a man sitting alone in the waiting area. Even from a distance, she could tell he was different from the usual travelers. His suit probably cost more than she made in 6 months, and he sat with the kind of perfect posture that spoke of boardrooms and power lunches. But there was something else about him, a heaviness that seemed to weigh down his shoulders, a distance in his eyes that she recognized. Grief, Grace thought. I know that look. David Anderson hadn't slept in 37 hours. The merger talks in Singapore had dragged on longer than expected, and now he was stuck waiting for a delayed connection to San Francisco. He should have taken the company jet, but something about flying commercial felt like penance, a small reminder that despite all his wealth and success, he was still just a man carrying wounds that money couldn't heal. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos, stopping at his favorite, a 4-year-old girl with untamed curls, sitting on a park swing with her arms spread wide like she was about to take flight. Olivia had been fearless, always ready for the next adventure. In the photo, a small bandage covered a cut on her eyebrow from a bicycle accident the week before. "Daddy, look, I'm flying," she had shouted that day, her voice full of pure joy. That was 3 weeks before she vanished forever. David closed his eyes, but the memories came anyway. They always did during these quiet moments. The sound of breaking glass. Linda's scream cut short. The empty bedroom with Olivia's stuffed elephant lying abandoned on the floor. 19 years. And he could still smell the fear in that room. The police had found Linda's body but never found Olivia. No ransom demands. No leads. No closure. Just a little girl who disappeared into thin air, and a father who had spent nearly 2 decades and $30 million searching for ghosts. Grace had noticed the man checking his phone repeatedly, his expression growing more pained with each glance. She'd seen that look before. People staring at photos of someone they'd lost. The way his thumb traced the screen reminded her of how she touched her own mysterious photograph. We're both haunted, she thought, steering her cart past the seating area. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Grace's wheel caught on a loose carpet edge, and she stumbled forward, her hand flying to her pocket to steady herself. The photograph slipped out, sliding across the polished floor like a leaf on water. It came to rest directly at the man's feet. David glanced down at the fallen picture, and his world stopped spinning. The face staring up at him was impossible. The same green eyes that haunted his dreams. The same wild curls he used to braid before bedtime. The same tiny scar on the left eyebrow from a pink bicycle that was probably still gathering dust in his garage. His phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering to the floor. "Oh, God," Grace said, rushing forward. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to—" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw his face. The man was staring at her photograph like he'd seen a ghost. His skin pale as paper, his hands trembling. "This picture," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where did you get this picture?" Grace knelt to retrieve it, her heart pounding. It's mine. I've had it since I was little." David's eyes moved from the photograph to Grace's face, and she watched in confusion as recognition dawned in his expression. He was studying her features with an intensity that made her want to run. "The eyes," he breathed. "You have her eyes." "Sir, are you okay? Should I call?" "What's your name?" David asked. Rising slowly from his chair, he moved like a man in a dream, his gaze never leaving her face. Grace Miller." "How old are you, Grace?" The question seemed strange, but something in his tone made her answer. 23. I'll be 24 next month." David's breathing became shallow. 23 years old, the same age Olivia would be now. The same eyes, the same stubborn chin that used to jut out when she was determined to get her way. "Grace," he said carefully, "where did you grow up?" "St. Anne's Orphanage, downtown." "Why are you asking me these? You don't remember anything before that." "Any family?" Grace shook her head, suddenly feeling exposed under his scrutiny. "No, nothing. Just this picture. The nuns said I was found with it when I was 4. David reached into his jacket pocket with shaking hands and pulled out his phone. He scrolled to the photo of Olivia and held it next to Grace's picture. They were identical. The same moment, captured from the same angle, but his copy was crisp and clear, while hers had faded with time. "This is impossible," Grace whispered, staring at the matching images. David looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "Grace Miller," he said, his voice breaking. I think you might be my daughter." The cleaning cart's handle slipped from Grace's grip, and it rolled away slowly, its wheels squeaking against the terminal floor. Around them, the airport continued its early morning routine, announcements echoing overhead, travelers hurrying past. But for Grace and David, the entire world had narrowed to this moment, this truth that hung between them like a bridge across 19 years of separation. Grace stared at the man before her, her mind reeling. Could this stranger in an expensive suit really be the father she'd dreamed about every night for as long as she could remember? Could this faded photograph finally lead her home? The words hung in the air between them like a prayer. Neither of them dared to believe. Grace felt her knees go weak, and she reached for the nearest chair, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. "Your daughter," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "That's impossible. I can't." David sat down across from her, still clutching his phone with the photograph displayed. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold it steady. "I know how this sounds. Believe me, I know. But look at the pictures, Grace. Really look at them." Grace compared the two images again, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every detail was identical. The angle of the sunlight, the swing set in the background, even the small butterfly that had landed on the chain. But it was more than that. Looking at David now, she could see traces of her own features in his face. The same stubborn jawline, the same way his eyebrows furrowed when he was concentrating. "This doesn't make sense," she said, shaking her head. "If you're my father, then where have you been? Why didn't you find me? Do you have any idea what it's like growing up thinking nobody wanted you?" The pain in her voice hit David like a physical blow. "I looked for you," he said urgently. "God, Grace, I never stopped looking. For 19 years, I've hired private investigators, posted rewards, followed every lead no matter how crazy it seemed. I've spent $30 million trying to find you." "Then how did I end up in an orphanage?" Grace's voice cracked. "How did I end up believing I was completely alone in this world?" David closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back in that house, reliving the worst night of his life. Your mother and I were having dinner. You were upstairs in your room, probably playing with that stuffed elephant you loved so much. We heard glass breaking downstairs. His voice grew distant, lost in the memory. Linda went to check. She thought maybe the cat had knocked something over. I heard her scream, and then gunshots. By the time I got downstairs, she was already gone. And there were men in our house. They had masks, guns. I ran upstairs to get you, but your room was empty. The window was open, and you were just gone. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. My mother is dead. Linda was the most beautiful person I've ever known, David said softly. She would have loved the woman you've become. She always said you had her determination and my stubborn streak. What happened to the men who took me? The police found 2 of them dead at the scene. Apparently they turned on each other during the robbery. The third one was never identified. We figured he took you, but there was never a ransom demand, never any contact. It was like you disappeared into thin air. Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks on her uniform. So, you think this third man just dropped me off at an orphanage? I don't know. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he couldn't go through with whatever he'd planned. The important thing is that you survived. And you're here now. I need proof, Grace said suddenly. I can't just take your word for this. It's too big, too impossible. David nodded immediately. Of course, we'll do DNA tests. I'll call my doctor right now. He can meet us at his office within the hour. At 4 a.m. Money talks, Grace, especially when you're desperate. 2 hours later. They sat in Dr. Harrison's private clinic in Beverly Hills. Grace had never been in a medical facility this luxurious. Marble floors, original artwork on the walls, and coffee that probably cost more than she made in a day. She felt completely out of place in her rumpled cleaning uniform. The results will be ready in 6 hours, Dr. Harrison explained, sealing the blood samples. I'm rushing them through our lab. As they left the clinic, David turned to Grace. Where would you like to wait? I could get us a hotel room, or we could go to my house. Or, I need to call in sick to work, Grace said, suddenly remembering her normal life. And I should probably let someone know where I am. Who would you call? Grace paused, realizing how pathetic her answer would sound. Catherine Sullivan. She's the director at St. Anne's. She's the closest thing I have to family. Something flickered across David's face, an expression Grace couldn't quite read. Catherine Sullivan. You know her. The name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. Tell me about her. As they drove through the empty streets toward David's house in the Hollywood Hills, Grace found herself talking about Catherine for the first time in years. She wasn't there when I first arrived at St. Anne's, but she came when I was about 8. She always paid special attention to me, made sure I had what I needed when the other kids got adopted and I didn't. She'd tell me that sometimes the best things come to those who wait longest. She sounds like she cares about you. She does. She's the one who convinced the orphanage to let me work at the airport, said I needed to see the world, even if it was just people passing through. David's house took Grace's breath away. It wasn't just the size, though it was easily 10 times larger than the orphanage, but the way it felt like a museum of grief. Every surface was covered with photographs of the same little girl at different ages, from birth to 4 years old. There were toys displayed in glass cases, clothes preserved as if she might come back to wear them. You kept everything, Grace whispered, picking up a framed photo of herself blowing out candles on a birthday cake. I couldn't let go. Linda used to say I was torturing myself, but after she died, these pictures were all I had left of either of you. Grace wandered through what had clearly been her childhood bedroom, now preserved like a shrine. Pink walls, a canopy bed, shelves lined with books and toys. On the nightstand sat a worn, stuffed elephant with one missing eye. Mr. Peanuts, she said suddenly, the name coming from nowhere. David spun around. You remember? I don't know. The name just came to me. Grace picked up the elephant, and for a moment, she could almost smell something familiar. Lavender and vanilla, like a mother's perfume. David's phone rang, startling them both. Dr. Harrison, he answered immediately. All ready? Are you sure? Okay, we'll be right there. Grace felt her heart stop. Well, David's face was radiant with joy and pain all mixed together. 99.7% probability, Grace Miller. You are Olivia Anderson. You're my daughter." The room seemed to tilt around Grace. She sank onto her childhood bed, still clutching Mr. Peanuts, trying to absorb the magnitude of what this meant. She wasn't an orphan. She wasn't unwanted. She had a father who had spent 19 years and a fortune trying to find her. But she also had a dead mother she couldn't remember, a life that had been stolen from her, and a past that felt more like a story someone had told her about someone else. "I don't know how to be your daughter," she whispered. David sat beside her on the small bed, careful not to touch her. "And I don't know how to be your father. But maybe we can figure it out together." Grace looked around the room, her room, and felt the weight of two different identities settling on her shoulders. Grace Miller, the orphan who cleaned airport floors and dreamed of belonging somewhere, and Olivia Anderson, the little girl who had been loved and protected until one terrible night changed everything. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we call Catherine Sullivan," David said. "I think it's time we told her that Grace Miller is coming home." 3 days later, Grace stood in the marble foyer of the Anderson mansion, surrounded by suitcases that contained her entire life. 2 uniforms, a handful of books, some toiletries, and the faded photograph that had started it all. Everything she owned fit into 3 small bags, a fact that seemed to highlight just how different her world was from this one. "Miss Olivia, welcome home," said Maria, the housekeeper, her warm smile not quite masking the confusion in her eyes. Grace could understand why. She looked nothing like what anyone would expect from David Anderson's long-lost daughter. "It's Grace, please," she said quietly. "I'm still getting used to all of this." David appeared from his study, his face lighting up when he saw her. "How are you settling in? Is your room comfortable? We can change anything you don't like." "It's perfect," Grace lied. The truth was, the bedroom, her childhood bedroom, felt like sleeping in a museum. Every toy, every book, every piece of furniture was exactly as she'd left it 19 years ago. Even the sheets smelled like expensive detergent instead of the industrial soap she was used to at the orphanage. "Catherine called this morning," David said, watching Grace's reaction carefully. "She wants to come by later to see how you're adjusting." Grace felt a wave of relief. Catherine Sullivan had been her anchor for the past 15 years, the one constant in a life full of uncertainty. When Grace had called to tell her about David, Catherine had been shocked but supportive, promising to help her navigate this new reality. "I'd like that," Grace said. "She's probably worried about me." "Of course. She seems very protective of you." The doorbell rang, and Maria went to answer it. Grace heard Catherine's familiar voice in the hallway and felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. A moment later, Catherine Sullivan entered the foyer, and Grace was struck by how out of place the older woman looked in the opulent surroundings. Catherine was in her mid-50s, with graying brown hair always pulled back in a practical bun, and clothes that spoke of thrift stores rather than boutiques. She'd dedicated her life to caring for forgotten children, and it showed in every line on her face. "Grace, sweetheart," Catherine said, pulling her into a familiar hug. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Grace said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Catherine turned to David, studying him with sharp eyes. "Mr. Anderson, I have to say, this whole situation is quite extraordinary. Mrs. Sullivan, I can't thank you enough for taking care of my daughter all these years," David said, extending his hand. "I know Grace considers you family." Catherine shook his hand, but Grace noticed something odd in her expression, a flicker of something that might have been recognition, quickly masked by her usual composed demeanor. "Please, call me Catherine, and Grace has been a blessing to us at St. Anne's. She's helped raise half the children who've come through our doors." As they moved to the living room, Grace felt increasingly uncomfortable. The conversation was polite but stilted, like 3 strangers trying to navigate a situation none of them fully understood. She perched on the edge of an antique sofa that probably cost more than most people made in a year, feeling like an impostor in designer clothes that David had insisted on buying her. "The police came by St. Anne's yesterday," Catherine mentioned casually. "They wanted to review your file, ask questions about when you first arrived, routine stuff for reopening the case." David leaned forward. What did they want to know? Just the basics. Who brought her in? What condition she was in? Whether she said anything about her past. Catherine's voice remained steady, but Grace noticed her hands clasping tightly in her lap. Poor thing was so traumatized when she first came to us. Wouldn't speak for months. I don't remember any of that, Grace said softly. Children block out traumatic memories, Catherine explained. It's the mind's way of protecting itself. After Catherine left, promising to visit again soon, David suggested showing Grace around the neighborhood. As they walked through the manicured streets of his exclusive community, Grace felt like she was touring a foreign country. Everyone here probably thinks I'm some kind of con artist, she said, watching a neighbor's gardener trim hedges into perfect geometric shapes. Why would you think that? Come on, David, look at me. I show up out of nowhere claiming to be your dead daughter. If I saw this story on the news, I'd think it was a scam too. David stopped walking. Grace, you are my daughter. The DNA doesn't lie. I know that, but it doesn't change the fact that I don't belong here. She gestured at the mansion-lined street. This isn't my world. I don't know how to live like this. You'll learn. What if I don't want to learn? The words came out sharper than she'd intended. What if I liked my life the way it was? David's face fell. Did you really like cleaning floors at 3 a.m? Living in a converted dormitory, wondering every day if you'd ever find your family? Grace felt tears sting her eyes. At least I knew who I was. Grace Miller might not have had much, but she belonged somewhere. Olivia Anderson is just a ghost, a little girl who died 19 years ago. You didn't die, David said firmly. You survived. You grew up strong and independent and brave. You're everything I hoped my daughter would become. But I'm not her, Grace whispered. I'm not the little girl in those pictures. I don't remember birthday parties or bedtime stories or any of the things that made her happy. I'm a stranger wearing her face. That evening, Grace sat in her childhood bedroom, staring at the photo albums David had given her. Page after page of a life she couldn't remember. First steps, Christmas mornings, family vacations. The little girl in the pictures looked so carefree, so loved, so different from the guarded young woman Grace had become. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in. David entered carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Maria made these. She said you used to love hot chocolate before bed. Grace accepted the mug gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. Something about the smell seemed familiar, comforting in a way she couldn't explain. I've been thinking, David said, sitting in the chair beside her bed. Maybe we're trying too hard to force this. Maybe instead of trying to make you remember being Olivia, we should focus on getting to know who Grace is. You'd want to do that. Grace, I lost my 4-year-old daughter 19 years ago, but I found something even better. A 23-year-old woman who survived things that would have broken most people. I want to know everything about her. Grace felt some of the tension in her chest ease. It's going to take time. We have time. All the time in the world. As David stood to leave, Grace called out to him. David, would you sing to me? Catherine mentioned you used to sing lullabies. David's eyes filled with tears. I'd love to. He sat back down and began to sing softly, a melody that seemed to come from some deep buried part of Grace's memory. As his voice filled the room, she felt something shift inside her, not quite remembering, but recognizing something that felt like home. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, David sang, his voice breaking slightly on the familiar words. Grace closed her eyes and let the melody wash over her. For the first time since this all began, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to be both Grace Miller and Olivia Anderson. Maybe she could build a bridge between who she'd been and who she was meant to be. Outside, Catherine Sullivan sat in her car at the end of the driveway, watching the warm light in the upstairs window. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her composed facade finally cracking to reveal the storm of emotions beneath. Sleep well, little Olivia, she whispered, her voice filled with a complexity of love and pain that no one could have understood. Tomorrow changes everything. Detective Ray Morrison had seen his share of cold cases, but the Anderson file was different. 19 years of dead ends, false leads, and a grieving father who refused to give up hope. Now, with Olivia Anderson miraculously returned from the dead, the case had exploded back to life with an urgency that had the entire department buzzing. Tell me about the night your daughter disappeared, Morrison said, sitting across from David in the precinct's interview room. It was their 3rd meeting this week, but each conversation revealed new details that had been buried under years of grief and trauma. David ran his hands through his hair, the motion betraying his exhaustion. Linda and I had just finished dinner. Olivia was upstairs in her room. She'd been playing with her dollhouse earlier. We heard glass breaking around 9:30, and you said your wife went to investigate first. Linda was always fearless that way. She grabbed the fireplace poker and went downstairs. I heard her shout, "Who's there?" And then, David's voice caught. 3 gunshots. By the time I got down there, she was already gone. Morrison made notes, though he'd heard this story multiple times. The 2 suspects we found dead at the scene, Marcus Webb and Tony Hernandez. They were small-time criminals, no history of kidnapping. Mostly burglary and drug-related offenses. What doesn't make sense is why they'd target your house specifically. We'd been featured in a magazine article about the tech industry the month before. The house, our success. It was all laid out for anyone to see. But if this was a simple robbery gone wrong, why take Olivia? Why not just run? David shook his head. That's what I've been asking myself for 19 years. Meanwhile, Grace sat in Dr. Sarah Chen's office across town, struggling with her first therapy session. The psychiatrist had been recommended by David, specializing in trauma recovery and repressed memories. I keep having these flashes, Grace said, fidgeting with the tissue box. Nothing clear, just moments. The smell of vanilla perfume, someone singing to me, a garden with yellow roses. Recovering childhood memories is rarely a linear process, Doctor. Chen explained gently. Your mind has been protecting you from trauma for 19 years. It's going to take time to feel safe enough to remember. What if I remember something terrible? What if I saw my mother die? We'll face whatever comes together. The important thing is that you're safe now. Grace nodded, though safety felt relative when your entire identity had been turned upside down. There's something else. I keep feeling like I recognize places I've never been. Yesterday, David took me to a restaurant, and I knew exactly where the bathroom was before anyone told me. I knew they served strawberry ice cream even though it wasn't on the menu. Those could be genuine memories surfacing. Your unconscious mind might be recognizing familiar environments. That evening, Catherine arrived for dinner at the Anderson mansion, carrying a casserole dish and wearing the same nervous smile she'd had during her first visit. Grace felt grateful for her presence. Catherine was the one piece of her old life that still made sense. You look tired, sweetheart, Catherine observed as they sat down to eat. Are you sleeping? Sometimes the bed is so soft I sink right through it, Grace laughed. I'm used to the orphanage cots. It's a big adjustment, David said. Maybe we should get you a firmer mattress. Catherine set down her fork, studying David with an expression Grace couldn't quite read. You know, Mr. Anderson? You look familiar to me. I can't shake the feeling we've met before. David paused mid-chew. I don't think so. I would have remembered. Maybe I saw you on the news during the search for Olivia. Your face was everywhere for months. Probably, David agreed. But Grace noticed something in his tone, a wariness that hadn't been there before. Later that night, Grace found herself wandering the house, unable to sleep. She ended up in David's study. Drawn by the warm light spilling from under the door, she knocked softly. Come in. David was sitting at his desk, surrounded by police reports and old newspaper clippings. The entire surface was covered with documents related to her disappearance. Photos, witness statements, detective reports. Can't sleep either, Grace asked. I keep thinking there's something I missed. Some detail that could help us understand what really happened that night. Grace picked up one of the photos from the crime scene. Her childhood home with police tape across the front door. It must have been horrible, losing everything at once. The house, the memories, your mother, you. It all disappeared in one night. I sold the place 6 months later. Couldn't bear to drive past it. What was she like, my mother? David's face softened. Linda was sunshine. Even on the worst days, she could find something to laugh about. She taught kindergarten before you were born, and she had this way of making everyone feel special. You inherited her optimism. I did. You don't remember? But you were always the happiest child. You'd wake up singing, fall asleep laughing. Linda used to say you collected joy like other kids collected toys. Grace tried to imagine herself as that carefree little girl, but it felt like looking at someone else's life through a window. I wish I could remember her. You will, Doctor. Chen says it just takes time. Grace picked up another document, a witness statement from someone named Catherine Sullivan. Her blood went cold as she read the header. "David," she said slowly. "Why is Catherine's name in this file?" David looked up, his face puzzled. "What do you mean?" Grace held up the statement. "This is from Catherine Sullivan, dated 3 days after the kidnapping. She gave a witness statement to the police." David took the document, his expression growing confused. "That can't be right. Catherine said she didn't know who I was until you introduced us." Grace read the statement aloud. "Catherine Sullivan, age 34, employed as a nanny for the Anderson family. On the night of the incident, I was working late in the kitchen when I heard glass breaking. I saw Mrs. Anderson go to investigate and heard gunshots. By the time I reached the living room, the intruders were gone, and Mrs. Anderson was deceased. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. She was our nanny," David whispered, the memory slowly returning. "How could I forget? She worked for us for almost a year before. Catherine was there that night." Grace felt the world tilt around her. "She lied to us. Catherine lied about knowing you." David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "She was in the house when it happened. She saw everything. Why wouldn't she tell us that? Maybe she was traumatized too. Maybe she blocked it out the same way I did." But even as Grace said the words, she didn't believe them. Catherine Sullivan was one of the most composed, reliable people she'd ever known. Catherine didn't forget things. She remembered every child's birthday, every medical appointment, every detail about the orphanage's operations. "We need to talk to her," David said. "Tomorrow we need to understand why she wouldn't tell us the truth." Grace nodded. But a cold feeling was spreading through her chest. Catherine had been more than just a caregiver to her. She'd been the closest thing to a mother Grace had ever known. The idea that Catherine had been keeping such a massive secret felt like another piece of her foundation crumbling away. "David," Grace said quietly, "what if there's more? What if Catherine knows something about what happened to me that night?" David turned from the window, his face grim. "Then we're going to find out exactly what she's been hiding." Outside, unbeknownst to them both, Catherine Sullivan sat in her car at the end of the driveway again, watching the lights in David's study. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "It's me," she said when the voice answered. "They're getting too close. We need to talk." Detective Morrison arrived at St. Anne's Orphanage early the next morning, armed with a search warrant and a team of forensic specialists. The Gothic brick building looked innocent enough in the morning sunlight, but Morrison had learned that appearances could be deceiving, especially when it came to Catherine Sullivan. "We need to see all records related to Grace Miller's arrival in 2005, Morrison told the nervous secretary. "Employment files, background checks, everything you have on Catherine Sullivan." 20 minutes later, Morrison was staring at documents that made his blood run cold. The employment application for Catherine Sullivan was pristine. Too pristine. The references were from institutions that had closed decades ago, and the Social Security number belonged to a woman named Catherine Mary Sullivan, who had died in a car accident in 1998. "Son of a bitch," Morrison muttered, reaching for his phone. Meanwhile, Grace and David were driving to St. Anne's, the witness statement burning like evidence between them. Grace stared out the window at the familiar neighborhoods of her childhood, but everything looked different now. Darker, more sinister. "Maybe there's an explanation," Grace said for the third time, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe she was protecting me somehow." "From what?" David asked. "Grace, she's been lying to both of us from the moment we met. That's not protection. That's deception." When they arrived at St. Anne's, they found police cars in the parking lot and officers carrying boxes of files. Grace's heart sank as she saw Detective Morrison approaching them. "Mr. Anderson, Grace, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about Catherine Sullivan." "What did you find?" David asked. "Catherine Sullivan, the real Catherine Sullivan, died 7 years before your daughter disappeared. The woman you know has been living under a stolen identity." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "That's impossible. I've known her for 15 years. I'm sorry, Grace, but the woman who's been caring for you isn't who she claims to be. We're running her fingerprints now, trying to figure out who she really is." David's phone rang, interrupting the conversation. "Catherine," he answered, his voice carefully neutral. "Where are you?" Grace could hear Catherine's voice through the speaker, though she couldn't make out the words. David's expression grew increasingly tense as he listened. "No, everything's fine," David lied. "Grace just wanted to see you. Could you come to the house this afternoon?" After he hung up, Morrison shook his head. "You shouldn't have done that. We need to bring her in for questioning. If you spook her—" "She'll run," David said. "This way. We can control the situation." Grace remained silent during the drive home, her mind reeling. Every memory she had of Catherine was now suspect. The bedtime stories, the birthday celebrations, the quiet moments when Catherine had been the only person who seemed to truly understand her. Had any of it been real? That afternoon, Catherine arrived at the Anderson mansion carrying fresh flowers and wearing the same warm smile that had comforted Grace through countless difficult moments. But now, looking at her through new eyes, Grace could see something else, a calculation behind the kindness that she'd never noticed before. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Catherine asked, settling into her usual chair in the living room. "You look pale." "I'm fine," Grace said, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. David paced by the window, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "Catherine, we need to ask you something. Yesterday we found some old police files from the night Grace was taken." Catherine's hands stilled on her teacup, but her expression remained serene. "Oh, what kind of files?" "A witness statement," Grace said quietly. "From you. You were there that night, weren't you? You were our nanny." For just a moment, Catherine's mask slipped. Grace saw something flash across her face. Fear, anger, calculation. Before the composed smile returned. "I think there's been some mistake," Catherine said carefully. "I would have told you if I'd known your family before." "Would you?" David asked, turning from the window. "Because the Catherine Sullivan who gave that statement worked for us for almost a year. She was in our house the night my wife was murdered and my daughter was taken. So either you're lying to us now, or you've been lying to us all along." Catherine set down her teacup with trembling hands. "David, Who are you?" Grace interrupted, her voice breaking. "If you're not Catherine Sullivan, then who are you? And why have you been lying to me my entire life?" The woman they'd known as Catherine Sullivan looked between them, her composure finally cracking completely. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder, more desperate. "You want to know who I am," she said, standing abruptly. "I'm the woman who saved you, Grace. I'm the woman who's loved you and protected you for 19 years while your precious father was playing detective and feeling sorry for himself." David stepped forward. "What are you talking about? You have no idea what really happened that night, do you?" Catherine laughed bitterly. "You think it was some random robbery? You think those men just happened to choose your house?" Grace felt ice forming in her veins. "What are you saying?" Catherine's eyes fixed on David with an intensity that was almost feral. "I loved you, David. For months. I watched you with Linda, watched you be happy with your perfect little family, and I loved you so much it felt like dying every single day." "You planned it," David whispered, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. "You planned the whole thing." "I planned to save you," Catherine shouted. "Linda was weak, David. She didn't deserve you. I was going to prove that I could be better for you, that I could love you the way you deserved to be loved." Grace stood up on shaking legs. "You killed my mother. It wasn't supposed to happen like that," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "The plan was just to scare her, to make her leave. But Linda fought back, and things got out of hand, and then you took me," Grace finished. "You kidnapped me to punish him." Catherine turned to Grace with desperate eyes. "I saved you, Grace. I saved you from a life of being reminded every day that your mother was dead. I gave you love, stability. You gave me nothing," Grace screamed, years of suppressed anger finally erupting. "You stole my life. You made me believe I was unwanted, that I was alone in the world, when my father was out there looking for me. Your father stopped looking," Catherine said viciously. "After 5 years, he gave up. He moved on, dated other women, tried to forget you existed. I was the one who never gave up on you." David was staring at Catherine with horror and rage. "You've been watching us this whole time. All these years. You've known where she was. And you let me suffer. You deserve to suffer," Catherine said quietly. "You deserve to know what it felt like to lose everything you loved." Grace felt something break inside her chest. Not just her heart, but something deeper. The foundation of trust that had carried her through the darkest moments of her childhood had been built on lies and manipulation. "Get out!" Grace whispered. "Grace, please! Get out!" Grace screamed, her voice echoing through the mansion. "Get out of my life! Get out of my father's house! I never want to see you again." Catherine stood frozen for a moment, looking between Grace and David. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. But as she reached the threshold, she paused and looked back. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "You think you know the truth now, but you have no idea how deep this goes. I've spent 19 years protecting you. Grace, without me, you'll never survive what's coming." After she left, Grace collapsed into David's arms, sobbing with a grief that felt bottomless. Everything she'd believed about her life, about love, about trust, had been shattered in the space of an hour. "I'm so sorry," David whispered, holding her tightly. "I'm so sorry I didn't protect you from her." Outside, Catherine Sullivan, or whoever she really was, sat in her car, watching the house where her carefully constructed world had just fallen apart. She pulled out her phone and made one final call. "It's time," she said when the voice answered. "If I can't have them, then no one can." Grace spent the night curled up in David's study, unable to face the bedroom that now felt contaminated by Catherine's lies. She'd refused to eat dinner, refused to take the sleeping pills Dr. Chen had prescribed, refused to do anything but stare at the police files scattered across David's desk. "You need to rest," David said gently, bringing her a cup of chamomile tea. "Catherine can't hurt you anymore, can't she?" Grace looked up at him with hollow eyes. "She's been controlling my life for 19 years, David. What makes you think she's going to stop now?" David sat beside her on the leather couch, careful not to crowd her. Since Catherine's revelation, Grace had flinched every time someone tried to touch her, as if physical contact itself had become dangerous. "Detective Morrison has an APB out on her. They'll find her." "You don't understand," Grace said, accepting the tea gratefully. "Catherine doesn't give up, ever. When I was 12, one of the other kids at St. Anne's tried to steal my photograph, the one that started all this. Catherine made his life hell for months until he transferred to another facility. She said nobody was allowed to hurt me, maybe in her twisted way. She really does care about you." Grace took a sip of the tea, savoring the warmth. "That's what makes it so sick. I think she actually believes she saved me." The tea had an unusual aftertaste, slightly bitter beneath the chamomile. Grace set the cup down, feeling suddenly dizzy. "Grace, are you okay?" The room was starting to spin. Grace tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her. "Something's wrong," she gasped, just as her vision began to blur. "Grace!" David caught her as she collapsed, her body convulsing. "Maria, call 911. The last thing Grace remembered was David's terrified voice shouting her name as darkness swallowed her whole. Grace woke up in Cedars-Sinai Medical Center with tubes in her arms and David holding her hand. Her throat felt raw, and her stomach ached like she'd been punched from the inside. "Thank God," David whispered when her eyes opened. "How do you feel?" "Like I got hit by a truck." Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "What happened?" "Arsenic poisoning. The doctors said if we'd gotten you here even an hour later." David's voice broke. "Grace, someone tried to kill you." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The tea. Catherine was in the house earlier. She could have put something in the tea. Detective Morrison appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Actually, she was never in the house today. We've been tracking her movements through security cameras. She's been holed up in a motel downtown all afternoon." "Then how?" "She had help," Morrison said. "We found traces of arsenic in your tea, but it was added recently. Someone with access to your house put it there." David went pale. "Maria's been with our family for 10 years. The gardener, the pool maintenance guy. They've all been background checked. What about delivery people, repair services, anyone who might have been in your kitchen today?" Grace struggled to remember through the fog of medication. "The flower delivery. Catherine always brings fresh flowers. But today someone delivered them earlier. Maria mentioned it while you were on the phone with Detective Morrison. Morrison was already on his radio, calling for backup to the flower shop. Within an hour, they had their answer. The delivery had been made by someone using a stolen van and fake credentials. The security footage was grainy, but the figure was clearly female, about Catherine's height and build. "She's escalating," Morrison said. "This wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned. She wanted to kill you slowly, make it look like an accident or illness." Grace felt sick again, and not just from the poison. Why would she do this, if she really loved me like she claimed? "Because you rejected her," David said quietly. "In her mind, if she can't be your mother, then nobody can." The next morning brought another revelation. Morrison arrived with a thick file and a grim expression. "We finally got a hit on her fingerprints," he said, sitting beside Grace's hospital bed. "Her real name is Patricia Donovan. She's wanted in connection with 3 other missing children cases across the country, dating back 25 years. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. 3 other children. 2 were never found. 1 was recovered after 6 months. But the child was so traumatized they never spoke again. The pattern is always the same. Patricia gets a job as a nanny or caregiver, becomes obsessed with the father, and when her advances are rejected, the children disappear." David was staring at the file photos in horror. "She's done this before. We weren't her first victims. According to the FBI profile, Patricia Donovan has severe attachment disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. She creates elaborate fantasies about the families she works for, believing she should replace the mother, when reality doesn't match her fantasy. She destroys everything," Grace finished. Morrison nodded. "The good news is that now we know who we're dealing with. We can predict her behavior. She'll try to contact you again, Grace. She won't be able to stay away." "What do you mean?" "In her mind, you're still her daughter. The poisoning was probably intended to make you sick enough to need her care again. When that failed, she'll try something else." Grace shuddered. "I want police protection." "Already arranged. But Grace, we need you to help us catch her. If she tries to contact you." "Absolutely not," David interrupted. "I'm not using my daughter as bait. Mr. Anderson, she's not going to stop. Patricia Donovan has been running for 25 years, and she's gotten very good at disappearing. Grace might be our only chance to end this." Grace looked between the 2 men. Feeling the weight of decision, Catherine, Patricia, had stolen 19 years of her life. How many other families had she destroyed? How many other children were still missing because of this woman's twisted obsession? "I'll do it," Grace said quietly. "Grace, no. David, she's not going to stop until one of us is dead. You heard what Detective Morrison said. She's done this before. There are other families out there who deserve answers." That afternoon, Grace's phone rang. The caller ID showed Catherine's number, and Morrison quickly activated the tracing equipment. "Hello, Catherine," Grace said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Grace, sweetheart, are you okay? I heard you were in the hospital." The casual concern in her voice was nauseating. "Why do you care? You're the one who poisoned me." A long pause. "I never wanted to hurt you, Grace. I was trying to save you." "Save me from what?" "From him. From David, don't you see? He's not your real family. I am. I'm the one who raised you, who loved you when you were scared and alone. He's just a stranger with your DNA." Grace closed her eyes, drawing on every acting skill she'd ever learned from watching telenovelas at the orphanage. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I was happier before. You were, sweetheart. You were safe with me. We can be safe together again. Where are you, Catherine? I want to see you." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you alone?" "David's at work. The police finished their questions yesterday. Everyone thinks you've left town. Meet me at St. Anne's, tonight at midnight. Come alone, Grace, or I'll disappear forever, and you'll never understand the truth about what really happened that night." The line went dead. Morrison looked up from his equipment with satisfaction. "We got her. The signal came from a cell tower near the orphanage. She's definitely in the area." Grace felt a mixture of relief and terror. Tonight, one way or another, this nightmare would end. Either Patricia Donovan would be captured, or Grace would finally learn just how far a twisted love could push someone toward destruction. "I want to be there," she told Morrison. "When you arrest her." "Grace, that's not—" "She stole my childhood, Detective. I want to look her in the eye when she realizes it's over." Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, but you stay in the car. And you wear a vest. No heroics, Grace agreed, though she suspected that when the time came, heroics might be exactly what the situation required. While Grace recovered in the hospital, Detective Morrison's team was working around the clock to uncover the full scope of Patricia Donovan's crimes. What they found in her abandoned motel room made even seasoned investigators sick to their stomachs. Jesus Christ, Morrison muttered, staring at the walls of room 237 at the Sunset Motel. Every surface was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, spanning nearly 2 decades, pictures of Grace at different ages, taken from a distance with telephoto lenses, Grace walking to school, Grace working at the airport, Grace sleeping in her dormitory bed. But it wasn't just surveillance photos. Patricia had created an elaborate shrine, complete with newspaper clippings about David's business successes, Grace's school achievements, and most disturbing of all, detailed plans for family reunions that had never happened. She's been stalking them both for 19 years, Detective Sarah Kim said, photographing the evidence. Look at this. She pointed to a journal lying open on the bed, filled with Patricia's handwriting in alternating red and black ink. The entries read like love letters to a family that existed only in her mind. March 15th, 2018. Olivia worked a double shift today. She looked tired. David should take better care of her. When we're together again, I'll make sure she gets proper rest. June 3rd, 2020. David was on the news talking about his charitable foundation. He's trying to fill the hole I created. But charity can't replace family. Soon he'll understand that I'm the only one who truly loves him. December 8th, 2023. Olivia cried herself to sleep again last night. The other girls at the orphanage don't understand her like I do. She needs her real mother. Morrison flipped through page after page of similar entries, each one revealing the depth of Patricia's delusion. In her mind, she hadn't destroyed the Anderson family. She had saved them from an inferior life, and was patiently waiting for them to realize it. There's more, Kim said, pointing to a box under the bed. Financial records, forged documents, and what looks like... Oh God! She pulled out a manila folder containing death certificates, all for women who had worked at various children's facilities where Patricia had been employed. The deaths were spread across different states and time periods, but the pattern was unmistakable. Each woman had died shortly after questioning Patricia's methods or getting too close to discovering her true identity. She's not just a kidnapper, Morrison said grimly. She's a serial killer who's been using the foster care system as her hunting ground for 25 years. The most damning evidence was a detailed timeline Patricia had created, documenting every step of her plan to destroy the Anderson family. The entries began 2 months before Grace's kidnapping, September 14, 2004. Started work as nanny for the Anderson family today. David barely looked at me. But that will change. Linda Anderson is weak. She doesn't deserve a man like him. October 2nd, 2004. Tried to show David how much better I am than Linda. Made his favorite dinner. Organized his office. But he thanked Linda instead of me. She's poisoning him against me. October 28, 2004. Overheard David and Linda talking about having another baby. I can't let that happen. The family is perfect with just Olivia. Any more children would ruin everything. November 15, 2004. Found the perfect men for the job. Marcus and Tony are desperate enough to do anything for money, and stupid enough to get caught. They think it's just a robbery, but I have bigger plans. December 12, 2004. Tonight is the night. After Linda is gone, David will finally see that I'm the one who truly loves him. I'll take Olivia somewhere safe until he's ready to accept us as his new family. The final entry, dated the night of the kidnapping, was written in red ink and filled with manic excitement. December 15, 2004. It's done. Linda is dead. But it went wrong. She fought back harder than expected, and David saw everything. He'll never forgive me now. I have to disappear with Olivia. If I can't have David's love, I'll have his daughter's. I'll make sure she never remembers him. Never wants to go back. She'll be mine forever. Morrison felt nauseated as he read Patricia's detailed account of the kidnapping. She described drugging 4-year-old Olivia with children's sleep medication, carrying her out through the bedroom window while David was calling 911, and driving through the night to a safe house she'd prepared in advance. But the most disturbing part was how she'd planned to erase Olivia's memory of her previous life. The child psychology books say that trauma can cause selective amnesia, especially in young children. If I control Olivia's environment carefully, no triggers, no reminders of her past, she'll eventually forget David and Linda entirely. I'll become her only family, her only source of love and security. She'll thank me for saving her from a life of grief. She didn't just kidnap Grace, Morrison realized. She psychologically programmed her to forget her own family. The evidence also revealed how Patricia had assumed Catherine Sullivan's identity. The real Catherine Sullivan had been a nun who worked with orphaned children in Oregon until her death in a car accident in 1998. Patricia had been working at the same facility and had stolen Catherine's identity documents before disappearing. She's been living Catherine Sullivan's life for 7 years before she even met the Andersons, Kim observed. This level of premeditation is staggering. When Morrison brought this evidence to Grace and David at the hospital, the reaction was explosive. David threw a water pitcher against the wall, his face purple with rage. She planned every second of it, he said, his voice shaking. Every moment of pain, every sleepless night, every time I blamed myself for not protecting my family. She orchestrated all of it. Grace sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of Patricia's manipulation. She made me believe I was unwanted, she whispered. For 19 years, she let me think nobody cared about me, when the truth was that she was the one keeping me from my family. There's more, Morrison said reluctantly. We found evidence that she's been watching you both continuously. She knew about every birthday you missed together, every milestone, every moment of grief, and she was enjoying it. David's hands clenched into fists. How many other families? We're still investigating, but we found connections to at least 8 missing children cases across 5 states. Grace, you're probably the only survivor who's old enough to testify about what she did. Grace looked at the journal entries Morrison had brought, her own face staring back at her from dozens of surveillance photos. She turned my entire life into her sick fantasy. Even at the orphanage, when I thought I was safe, she was watching, controlling everything. The other children at St. Anne's, David started, are being interviewed as we speak, Morrison confirmed. It looks like Patricia systematically eliminated any child who got too close to Grace or asked too many questions about her past. 3 kids who tried to befriend her were transferred to other facilities within weeks. Grace felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She isolated me from everyone. I always wondered why I couldn't make friends, why other kids seemed afraid of me after a while. It wasn't your fault, David said firmly. David, none of this was your fault. But don't you see? Grace looked at him with tears in her eyes. She didn't just steal 19 years from us. She stole my ability to trust, to love, to believe that I deserved a family. Even now, knowing the truth, part of me still feels like that unwanted little girl she created. Morrison closed the file. Grace, I need you to understand something. Tonight, when we arrest Patricia Donovan, you're not just getting justice for yourself. You're potentially saving dozens of other children from the same fate. Grace nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. Then let's end this. As night fell over Los Angeles, 3 teams of officers took their positions around St. Anne's orphanage. Patricia Donovan's 25-year reign of terror was about to end. But none of them could have predicted just how far she was willing to go to keep her twisted version of family intact. The abandoned St. Anne's orphanage looked like something out of a nightmare at midnight. The Gothic brick building cast long shadows in the moonlight, its broken windows staring down like hollow eyes. Grace sat in Detective Morrison's unmarked car, wearing a bulletproof vest under her jacket and fighting the urge to vomit. Remember, we'll be monitoring everything through the wire, Morrison said, adjusting the tiny microphone hidden in Grace's collar. The moment you feel unsafe, just say the word elephant, like your old stuffed animal. We'll move in immediately. Grace nodded, though her mouth was too dry to speak. David squeezed her hand from the back seat, his face pale with worry. You don't have to do this, he said for the 10th time. We can find another way. No, we can't, Grace replied. She's not going to stop until one of us is dead. This ends tonight. At exactly midnight, Grace walked through the orphanage's front gate, her footsteps echoing in the empty courtyard. The building had been closed for 5 years due to budget cuts, leaving behind a hollow shell of memories. As she approached the main entrance, the heavy wooden door creaked open. "Grace, sweetheart," Patricia's voice called from the darkness inside. "I knew you'd come." Grace stepped into the familiar hallway, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through dirty windows. The place smelled of dust and decay, but underneath it was the faint scent of the disinfectant that had always permeated the orphanage, a smell that instantly transported her back to childhood. "Where are you, Catherine?" Grace called, using the name deliberately. "Don't call me that anymore," Patricia said, emerging from the shadows near the old reception desk. She looked different, wilder, more dangerous. Her usually neat hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her clothes were wrinkled and stained. "Catherine Sullivan is dead. She's been dead for 27 years. Then who are you?" Patricia smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm your real mother, Grace. I'm the one who's loved you every single day since you were 4 years old." "You're Patricia Donovan," Grace said, taking a step back. "You're a kidnapper and a murderer." "I'm a woman who loved too much," Patricia corrected, moving closer. "Do you know what it's like to love someone so completely that their happiness becomes your entire reason for existing?" "That's what I felt for your father." Grace felt her skin crawl. "You killed my mother." "Linda was in the way," Patricia said matter-of-factly. "She was weak, Grace. She would have raised you to be weak too. But look at you now. Strong, independent, a survivor. You became everything I hoped you'd be. Because I had to survive what you put me through." Patricia's expression darkened. "What I put you through? I gave you love, Grace. I gave you stability, education, a home. Do you think David would have done better? He was falling apart even before Linda died. He would have shipped you off to boarding school or hired a parade of nannies to raise you." Grace realized. Patricia truly believed her own twisted logic. In her mind, she had saved Grace from an inferior life. "You made me believe I was unwanted," Grace said, her voice shaking with anger. "For 19 years I thought nobody cared whether I lived or died. But I cared," Patricia said desperately. "Every single day I cared. When you were sick, I sat by your bed all night. When you cried, I held you. When other children were cruel to you, I made sure they were transferred away. Everything I did was to protect you. You isolated me from everyone. I protected you from people who would have hurt you." Patricia's voice rose to a shout. "Just like I'm trying to protect you now from David, don't you see? He doesn't really want you back. He wants the 4-year-old daughter he lost. He wants Olivia, not Grace." Grace felt tears streaming down her face. "You're wrong." "Am I? Has he asked you about your life? Your dreams? Your fears? Or does he just keep trying to turn you back into his precious little Olivia?" The words hit closer to home than Grace wanted to admit. David had been trying so hard to recreate their lost relationship that sometimes she did feel like she was failing to live up to the memory of who she used to be. "That doesn't give you the right to destroy my family," Grace said. "I am your family," Patricia screamed. "I'm the only family you've ever really had." Suddenly, Patricia lunged forward and grabbed Grace's arm, pressing something cold and metallic against her side. Grace looked down and saw the barrel of a small pistol. "Patricia, what are you doing?" "Saving you from making the biggest mistake of your life," Patricia said, backing toward the staircase while keeping the gun pressed against Grace's ribs. "You're coming with me." "Grace, we're leaving Los Angeles tonight. And this time, no one will ever find us. The police know who you are," Grace said, trying to keep her voice calm. "They know about the other children, the other families. There's nowhere left to run. There's always somewhere to run when you have nothing left to lose." They climbed the stairs to the second floor. Patricia's grip on Grace's arm painful and desperate. The old dormitory hallway stretched out before them, lined with empty rooms that had once housed dozens of children. "This is where you belonged," Patricia said, forcing Grace into her old dormitory room. "This is where you were safe, where you were mine." The room was exactly as Grace remembered it. 8 narrow beds, a single window, bare walls painted institutional green. But now it felt like a prison cell. "You can't keep me here," Grace said. "People will look for me." "Let them look," Patricia said, locking the door behind them. "By the time they find this place, we'll be long gone. I have a car waiting, new identities prepared. We can start over somewhere else, somewhere David will never find us." Grace noticed Patricia's hands were shaking violently. The woman was clearly unraveling, which made her more dangerous than ever. "Patricia, listen to me," Grace said carefully. "I know you think you love me, but this isn't love. Love doesn't involve kidnapping and murder." "Don't lecture me about love," Patricia snapped. "You have no idea what real love is. I gave up everything for you. My identity, my freedom, my entire life. I spent 19 years watching you grow up from a distance, making sure you were safe, making sure you had everything you needed. But you also made sure I could never be happy," Grace said. "Every time I got close to someone, you drove them away. Every time I started to hope for a family, you crushed that hope. That's not love, Patricia. That's control." Patricia's face contorted with rage and pain. "You ungrateful little bitch, after everything I've done for you. Everything I've sacrificed." "You sacrificed nothing," Grace shouted back. "You took a 4-year-old child away from her family because you couldn't handle being rejected by a man who didn't love you." Patricia raised the gun, pointing it directly at Grace's chest. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I should have let you die with Linda that night. Maybe that would have been kinder than watching you turn against me." Grace felt terror wash over her, but also a strange sense of clarity. She was done being Patricia Donovan's victim. "If you're going to kill me," Grace said quietly, "then kill me. But don't pretend you're doing it out of love. You're doing it because you can't stand the thought of losing control." Patricia's finger tightened on the trigger, her face twisted with years of suppressed rage and obsession. "If I can't be your mother," she whispered, "then no one can be your family." Outside, Detective Morrison heard Grace's last words through the wire and gave the signal to his team. Within seconds, the building was surrounded. But they all knew that for Grace, rescue might already be too late. The sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the orphanage's lower corridors made Patricia's head snap toward the door. Her grip on the gun tightened as she realized the police had found them. "You called them," she hissed at Grace. "You led them here. I didn't have to," Grace said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "You've been running for 25 years, Patricia. Did you really think it would last forever?" Patricia's face twisted with betrayal and rage. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me, by bringing them here to destroy our family." "We were never a family," Grace said firmly. "You were my captor. There's a difference." The footsteps were getting closer now, accompanied by the crackle of police radios. Patricia backed toward the window, dragging Grace with her, the gun still pressed against her ribs. "Patricia Donovan," Detective Morrison's voice boomed through a megaphone from outside. "The building is surrounded. Release Grace and come out with your hands up." Patricia laughed bitterly. "They think they can save you. They have no idea what you really are, what I really am. You're damaged goods, Grace. Broken, ruined by what happened to you. Do you think David will still want you when he realizes how fucked up you are? When he sees that you'll never be his perfect little Olivia again?" Grace felt something crack inside her chest, but it wasn't her heart breaking. It was the last chain that had bound her to this woman's psychological manipulation. "You're right," Grace said quietly. "I am damaged. I am broken in some ways, but that's because of what you did to me, not because of who I am. And you know what? I'm still standing. I survived you, Patricia. I survived your twisted love and your psychological torture, and I became someone strong enough to face you." Patricia's hand began to shake more violently. "You don't understand. Without me, you're nothing. You're just a scared little girl with no family, no identity, no—" "I'm Grace Miller," Grace interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "I'm a woman who worked 3 jobs to put herself through community college. I'm someone who helped raise dozens of kids at St. Anne's who made sure they felt loved even when I didn't know what love was. I'm someone who survived being kidnapped and brainwashed and still managed to become a decent human being. That's who I am. And you didn't make me that way. I made me that way. In spite of what you did." "You're lying," Patricia whispered, but Grace could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. "And I'm also Olivia Anderson," Grace continued. "I'm a daughter who was loved so much that her father spent 19 years and $30 million trying to find her. I'm part of a family that was torn apart by your jealousy and obsession, but we're still here. We survived you." Heavy footsteps were now in the hallway outside their door. Patricia spun toward the sound, and in that moment of distraction, Grace saw her chance. She grabbed Patricia's wrist and twisted hard, trying to force the gun away from her body. Patricia screamed and tried to pull free, but Grace held on with the strength of 19 years of suppressed rage. "You don't own me anymore," Grace shouted as they struggled. The gun went off, the bullet shattering the window behind them. Patricia stumbled backward, off balance, and Grace pushed with everything she had. Patricia hit the wall hard, the gun flying from her grasp and skittering across the floor. The door burst open as Detective Morrison and his team flooded into the room. Weapons drawn. But Patricia wasn't finished. She scrambled for the gun, her face contorted with desperate fury. "If I can't have you, then no one can," she screamed, raising the weapon toward Grace. David appeared in the doorway behind the officers. "Grace." Time seemed to slow as Patricia's finger tightened on the trigger. Grace saw the hatred in her eyes, the 25 years of twisted obsession finally reaching its breaking point. But she also saw something else, the pathetic desperation of a woman who had built her entire identity around controlling other people's lives. Grace didn't run. She didn't cower. Instead, she stepped forward. "Do it," she said quietly. "Pull the trigger, Patricia. Show everyone what your love really looks like." Patricia hesitated, confusion flickering across her face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Grace was supposed to be afraid, supposed to beg for her life, supposed to need Patricia's protection. "I said do it," Grace shouted. "If this is love, then kill me. Show my father what 19 years of your love has accomplished." Patricia's hand began to shake uncontrollably. "I was trying to save you. You were trying to own me," Grace said, taking another step closer. "But you can't own people, Patricia. You can't force them to love you. You can't steal children and call it family. You can't murder mothers and call it salvation." Patricia's face crumpled as the full weight of her actions finally hit her. The gun wavered in her grip. "I loved you," she whispered. "No," Grace said firmly. "You loved the idea of me. You loved having control over me. But you never loved me, because you never even tried to know who I really am." Patricia looked around the room, at the police officers with their weapons trained on her, at David's horrified face, at Grace standing defiantly before her. For the first time in 25 years, she seemed to see reality clearly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, lowering the gun slightly. "I'm so sorry." "It's too late for sorry," Grace said. Patricia's expression changed one final time, shifting from broken remorse to cold calculation. She raised the gun again, but this time she pointed it at her own temple. "If I can't have my family," she said, "then I don't want to live." "Patricia." "Don't!" Detective Morrison started forward, but Patricia had already made her choice. The second gunshot was muffled, final. She collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath her head, her eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Grace stood frozen for a moment, staring at the body of the woman who had shaped her entire life through violence and manipulation. Then her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees, not from grief, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing it was finally over. David rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms as she began to shake with delayed shock. "It's okay," he whispered. "It's over. You're safe now." Grace clung to him, finally allowing herself to cry, not for Patricia, but for the little girl who had been stolen, for the years that had been lost, for the family that had been torn apart by one woman's twisted obsession. "I want to go home," she whispered. "Where's home?" David asked gently. Grace looked up at him through her tears, seeing not the stranger she'd met in an airport, but the father who had never stopped looking for her. "Wherever you are," she said. Outside, the police secured the scene and began the long process of documenting Patricia Donovan's final crime. But for Grace and David, the only thing that mattered was holding each other in the ruins of their past. Finally, free to build something new. 6 months later, Grace stood in front of the newly renovated St. Anne's Orphanage, watching construction workers hang a fresh sign above the entrance. The Linda Anderson Memorial Children's Home. The Gothic brick building looked completely different now. Bright, welcoming, with large windows that let in streams of sunlight and colorful murals painted by local artists. "The children's therapy wing will be finished next week," David said, joining her on the sidewalk. Dr. Chen says it's going to be one of the most advanced childhood trauma treatment centers on the West Coast. Grace smiled, still amazed by how much had changed in such a short time. Mom would have loved this, wouldn't she? It had taken months of therapy before Grace felt comfortable calling Linda Mom, and even longer before she stopped feeling like she was betraying Catherine, Patricia, by embracing her true family. But Dr. Chen had helped her understand that healing didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant choosing what parts of it to carry forward. "She would have been so proud of you," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Linda always believed that our greatest pain could become our greatest purpose." Through intensive therapy, Grace had slowly begun to recover fragments of her early childhood memories. She remembered Linda's laugh, the way she smelled like vanilla and lavender, the stories she used to tell about brave princesses who saved themselves. But more importantly, she'd learned to forgive herself for not remembering sooner. Grace. A group of children came running from the building's playground, their faces bright with excitement. These were the first residents of the new children's home, kids who had been failed by the system, just like Grace had been. "Miss Grace, look what I drew." 7-year-old Maya held up a crayon drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "It's me and you." Grace knelt down to Maya's level, studying the artwork seriously. "It's beautiful. Maya, I love the rainbow. It means hope, doesn't it?" Maya nodded enthusiastically. "Mrs. Patterson says rainbows come after storms, just like families can come after being lost." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. Mrs. Patterson was the new director of the children's home, a warm, genuinely caring woman who had been thoroughly vetted by both the police and child services. Under her supervision, the home had become everything Grace had dreamed of as a child, a place where kids felt loved, valued, and hopeful about their futures. "That's exactly right," Grace said, hugging Maya tightly. "And you know what? Sometimes the most beautiful rainbows come after the biggest storms." As the children ran back to play, David put his arm around Grace's shoulders. "How are you feeling about the interview tomorrow?" Grace took a deep breath. Tomorrow, she would be appearing on 60 Minutes to tell her story publicly for the first time. The interview was part of a larger investigation into Patricia Donovan's crimes, which had led to the discovery of 2 more missing children and the reopening of dozens of cold cases across the country. "Nervous," Grace admitted, "but ready. If my story can help even one family find their missing child, then it's worth it." The past 6 months had been a roller coaster of legal proceedings, media attention, and personal healing. Grace had testified before a grand jury about Patricia's crimes, helped the FBI identify other potential victims, and worked with child advocacy groups to improve safety protocols in foster care systems nationwide. But the most important work had been rebuilding her relationship with David. "I have something for you," David said, pulling a small wrapped box from his pocket. "I know it's not your birthday, but..." Grace opened the box to find a delicate gold necklace with a pendant shaped like an elephant, not unlike her childhood stuffed animal, Mr. Peanuts, but more elegant, more grown-up. "David, it's beautiful," read the inscription. Grace turned the pendant over and saw tiny engraved words. "To Grace, Olivia, my daughter, my hero, love, Dad." For a moment, Grace couldn't speak. The necklace represented everything she'd learned about herself over the past 6 months, that she could be both Grace and Olivia, that she could honor her survival while embracing her heritage, that she could be strong and vulnerable at the same time. "Thank you," she whispered, letting David fasten the necklace around her neck. They walked together through the memorial garden they'd planted behind the children's home. The centerpiece was a beautiful rose garden with a marble bench bearing a plaque, "In memory of Linda Anderson and all the children who are still searching for home." Grace sat on the bench, running her fingers over her mother's name. "I wish I could remember more about her." "You remember the important things," David said, sitting beside her. "Her kindness, her strength, her belief that love conquers everything. Those parts of her live in you now." Grace nodded, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. The investigation into Patricia's crimes had revealed a network of corruption and negligence that had allowed her to operate for decades. As a result, new laws had been passed requiring more thorough background checks for child care workers, better communication between agencies, and mandatory trauma counseling for children entering the foster system. Detective Morrison called this morning, David said. They found another one of Patricia's victims, a boy named Michael who disappeared in Oregon 15 years ago. He's alive, Grace. He's going to be reunited with his family next week. Grace felt a surge of bittersweet joy. How many does that make? 4 children recovered alive, plus leads on 6 others. Your courage in facing her probably saved dozens of lives. Grace thought about Patricia's final moments, the choice she'd made to end her own life, rather than face the consequences of her actions. Even now, Grace struggled with complex feelings about the woman who had raised her. Patricia had been a monster, but she'd also been the only mother figure Grace had known for most of her life. Do you ever think about her? David asked gently. Every day, Grace admitted. Dr. Chen says that's normal, that loving someone and recognizing their evil aren't mutually exclusive. I loved Catherine Sullivan, the version of Patricia that she showed me, but I also understand now that that person never really existed. A soft breeze rustled through the rose garden, carrying the sweet scent of the flowers they'd planted in Linda's honor. Grace closed her eyes and let herself remember one of the recovered memories, sitting in this same garden as a 4-year-old, helping her mother plant bulbs while Linda sang softly about flowers that would bloom in spring. I'm ready to move forward, Grace said suddenly. Not just from Patricia, but from the past entirely. I want to focus on building something new. David smiled. What did you have in mind? I want to go back to school, study child psychology, maybe social work. I want to make sure no other child has to go through what I did. That's a beautiful goal. And I want us to be a real family, not the family we used to be, and not the family Patricia tried to force us to be, but something new, something we choose. David reached over and took her hand. I'd like that more than anything. As the sun began to set over Los Angeles, Grace felt a sense of peace she'd never experienced before. She was no longer the lost little girl cleaning airport floors at 3 a.m, dreaming of a family that might not exist. She was no longer the victim of Patricia Donovan's twisted obsession. She was Grace Olivia Anderson, survivor, daughter, advocate, and finally, truly free. Come on, she said, standing up and pulling David toward the children's home. Mrs. Patterson is making spaghetti tonight, and the kids will never forgive us if we're late for dinner. As they walked back toward the building filled with children's laughter, Grace touched the elephant pendant at her throat and smiled. She had finally found her way home.